80 AD, the Roman Colosseum, 50,000 people screaming. In the center of the arena, a woman chained to a wooden structure. Naked, terrified, suddenly they release a bull. Not to kill her, for something worse. The guards have built a mechanical replica of a cow. They shove the woman inside and force the bull to mount her. It's an execution, but disguised as the myth of Pasiphae, the queen who had sex with a bull. The crowd applauds, children watch, senators laugh. Welcome to Roman entertainment. This isn't fiction, it really happened. The poet Martial was there at the Colosseum's inauguration, and he wrote it down. We saw Pasiphae joined to the bull. The ancient legend received testimony under Caesar. Rome, the greatest empire in history, laws, aqueducts, philosophy, and this, public rape turned into family entertainment. Today you're going to discover the most brutal, most perverted, most inhuman spectacles that Rome organized in the arena. Things Hollywood would never show, that your teachers never mentioned, but that the Romans documented in detail. Because this wasn't madness, it was politics, propaganda, control, and it was completely legal. I'm Crown and Dagger, and here there's no censorship. Only the truth Rome prefers you forget. Notice how, when they talk about the Colosseum, they always mention heroic gladiators? But they never tell you this. Every week, Crown and Dagger unearths the most disturbing stories the world prefers to ignore. If you want unfiltered history, hit like and subscribe, because what comes next is much more brutal. Rome, 1st to 4th century AD, 60 million people, the largest empire in human history, and every major city had one thing in common: an arena, over 250 amphitheatres across Roman territory. The Colosseum held 50,000 spectators, and it was packed almost daily. Here's what you need to understand. This wasn't random violence. It was industrial-scale death. The historian Eutropius calculated that over 400,000 people died in Roman arenas across 4 centuries. That's an entire city, erased for entertainment. At the Colosseum's inauguration, Emperor Titus celebrated with 100 consecutive days of games. 9,000 animals slaughtered. That's 90 deaths per day, for fun. Emperor Trajan, after conquering Dacia, 123 days of games. 10,000 gladiators. Thousands of prisoners executed. The philosopher Seneca attended these games and wrote something chilling. I come home more greedy, more cruel, more inhuman, because I have been among humans. He watched the midday executions. Criminals tied to stakes, lions released, the crowd betting on how long each victim would scream before dying. That was lunch entertainment. Why? Because the arena did something no other institution could. It taught obedience through pleasure. When you watch a man torn apart, you learn what happens to Rome's enemies. When you cheer as someone dies, you become complicit. And that complicity was the point. According to historian Cassius Dio, Rome spent more on arena entertainment than on roads, schools, or hospitals by the 2nd century AD. They had supply chains bringing lions from Africa, criminals from Gaul, Christians from Judea. It was bureaucratic, scheduled, budgeted. Death, packaged as entertainment, delivered daily to a population addicted to brutality. What you just heard, that was the system. Now let me show you what actually happened in that sand. The spectacles that made 50,000 people cheer while humanity died in front of them. Starting with how it all began. At a funeral, with blood. 264 BC. 3 sons wanted to honor their dead father, not with prayers, but with blood. They armed 3 pairs of slaves and forced them to fight to the death in the Forum Boarium, a cattle market reeking of dung and smoke. This wasn't entertainment. It was munus, a duty owed to the dead. The practice came from Rome's enemies, the Campanians and Samnites. They believed restless spirits needed blood to find peace. But Roman elites saw something else: power. A funeral with bloodshed proved wealth. A funeral with spectacular bloodshed proved dominance. By the 3rd century BC, Politicians were using funeral games as campaign tools. The Senate called it piety. The crowd knew it was politics. Even the armor told stories. The Samnite gladiator wore gear mimicking Rome's conquered enemies. Every slash was a replay of Roman victories. Death became propaganda. Temporary wooden stands gave way to permanent amphitheaters. Temples to violence, where death whispered the same message. Rome commands men, armies, even death itself. If funeral games were how it started, what came next turned the arena into Rome's cruelest spectacle. Because Rome discovered something. Exotic suffering sells better than ordinary death. Lions from North Africa, leopards from the Caucasus, crocodiles from the Nile, giraffes dragged across deserts. They weren't displayed as wonders. They were condemned as prey in a carnival of slaughter. Romans called these shows Venationes, hunts, but they weren't hunts. They were executions of nature itself. Julius Caesar set the tone in 46 BC, parading a giraffe, the first ever seen in Europe. They called it a camelopardalis because Rome had no word for it. It didn't matter. The animal was thrown into the sand to be torn apart. The message: if Rome could seize the strangest beasts alive, it could conquer anything. The slaughter exploded. At the Colosseum's inauguration, Emperor Titus oversaw the deaths of more than 9,000 animals in one festival. Archaeologists found bones etched with deliberate starvation marks. Lions and bears were weakened beforehand to ensure a quick, bloody kill. Behind the scenes, logistics were brutal. Caravans dragged cages through scorching deserts. Fleets floated them down the Nile. Handlers risked their lives delivering living trophies to a city that demanded fresh blood with every sunrise. Pliny the Elder warned that rare species were vanishing from their homelands. Lions, leopards, elephants pushed toward extinction. The Colosseum wasn't just a theatre of death, it was an ecological wrecking ball. Animal massacres drew crowds, but Rome wanted more. They wanted suspense, imbalance, fights where the outcome was rigged but the suffering was real. They wanted theatre disguised as combat. When you picture a gladiator, you imagine two evenly matched warriors. The reality was twisted. Rome thrived on imbalance. Contests engineered for cruelty. Prisoners and criminals were shoved into the arena, dressed as clowns, handed wooden swords, and sent to die against seasoned killers. The crowd jeered as the doomed flailed and fell. Public execution disguised as sport. The weapons became characters. The retiarius fought with a fisherman's net and trident against the secutor, whose helmet was designed to deflect the net. It wasn't skill. It was suspense. Would the net ensnare or would the sword break through? Sometimes one gladiator faced multiple foes. Other times, entire units clashed, turning the arena into a swamp of blood and mangled corpses. The helmets were weapons of torment. Some narrowed vision, forcing fighters to stumble half-blind while the audience roared with laughter. Others were so heavy that raising one's head became agony. Armor wasn't protection, it was punishment. Gladiators dressed as barbarians, forced to mimic Rome's defeated enemies. Their inevitable loss reminded everyone. The empire always prevails. Mismatched combat was cruel, but it wasn't the worst, because Rome had a special category of victims. People who weren't meant to fight. They were meant to die screaming while the crowd laughed. By midday, combat gave way to theatre, with death at centre stage. Romans called it Damnatio ad Bestias, condemnation to the beasts, criminals, deserters, slaves, prisoners of war. They became unwilling actors in executions disguised as myth. Each punishment matched the crime. Thieves torn apart by wolves, arsonists burned alive, traitors thrown to lions. Every scene was a morality play, written in real blood. Lions were starved to a frenzy before release. Bears chained in pits were goaded into fury. The uncertainty, would the beast strike fast or toy with its prey, kept the stands howling for more. During Emperor Trajan's celebrations after conquering Dacia, thousands of captives were slaughtered over 123 days. It wasn't random. It was organized. paced like acts in a drama, every death crafted to keep the audience on edge. The historian Strabo recorded victims tied to stakes with wild boars released. The boars, trained to attack movement, would gore prisoners, while the crowd placed bets on how long each victim would scream. This wasn't justice. It was entertainment with a moral veneer. Pause for a second. 4 spectacles in. Thousands dead. Species extinct. Humans turned into props. And if you think this is the worst Rome did, you're wrong. Because what comes next is where execution stopped being about death and became pure, sadistic theatre. For the condemned, it wasn't enough to die. They had to perform their demise, acting out Rome's myths with their own bodies. Prisoners forced to play doomed heroes. Orpheus, the musician who tamed beasts. In myth, animals sat enchanted. In the arena, a bear was released mid-performance and mauled the singer to death. The poet Martial witnessed this. We saw Orpheus. If he delayed, the beasts would have obeyed, but he was torn apart. Another victim forced to play Daedalus, suspended on crude wings. He soared briefly before plunging to the beasts below. Martial quipped, "The man must have wished for real feathers." The most grotesque, Pasiphae and the bull. One show staged her union with a mechanical beast, followed by a mauling that blurred execution, humiliation, and pornography. Tertullian recorded that female prisoners were sometimes dressed as priestesses and violated in front of the crowd before being killed. The message? Rome owned its myths just as it owned its people. Heroes, villains, kings, queens. None were safe from being rewritten as props in a pageant of death. For spectators, sideshows. For the condemned, agonizing ends dressed in costumes. For Rome, propaganda made flesh. Everything so far happened on land, in a normal arena. But Rome wasn't satisfied. They asked, what if we flooded the arena? What if we brought the ocean to the desert and made men die at sea? Mock naval battles, Naumachiae, were spectacles on an insane scale where water itself became a weapon. Julius Caesar in 46 BC dug an enormous basin near the Tiber, filled it with water and ships. Thousands of captives shoved aboard, told to fight as rival fleets. They weren't actors. They were men condemned to die for applause. Arrows, catapults, steel.